April 1872, Sweetwater Creek, Wyoming Territory. The shimmering heat rose like spirits from the cracked earth, wavering across the dusty yard of the Tumbleweed Ranch. Harlow O'Brien stared at the worn piece of parchment in her trembling hands, the spidery handwriting as indecipherable to her as the stars were to a blind man. Her mother's last gift, a recipe that might as well have been written in Greek for all the good it did her. Tears pricked behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Crying wouldn't save her father's ranch, and it certainly wouldn't teach her to read. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her hastily tuck the recipe into her apron pocket. A lone rider emerged from the golden haze of sunset, his lean silhouette cutting a striking figure against the amber sky. She shaded her eyes with one hand, watching as he dismounted in one fluid motion that spoke of a lifetime spent in the saddle. "Evening, miss," the young man called, removing his hat to reveal waves of chestnut hair that caught the dying sunlight. "Name's Samuel McKinnon. I'm looking for Mr. O'Brien." Harlow smoothed her simple blue calico dress, suddenly conscious of the flour dusting her hands and the wild strands of copper hair that had escaped her practical braid. "My father's not receiving visitors. The doctor's with him now." Samuel's face fell, revealing features that were as kind as they were handsome. His clean-shaven jaw tensed slightly, a hint of disappointment crossing eyes the color of prairie grass. "I'm sorry to hear that. I've come about the ranch hand position." "You're too late," she replied, her voice catching. "We can't afford to hire anyone. Not anymore." Before Samuel could respond, a gruff voice called from the porch. "Harlow, who's that out there?" "Just a traveler, Pa," she called back, then lowered her voice. "Please, you should move along. There's nothing for you here." Samuel didn't budge. Instead, his eyes swept over the peeling paint of the farmhouse, the empty corrals, and the neglected fields beyond. "Seems to me like you could use an extra pair of hands, whether you can pay or not." The doctor emerged from the house then, his face grave as he descended the steps and approached Harlow. "Your father needs rest and proper meals, Miss O'Brien. This fever won't break if he's not properly nourished." When the doctor departed, Harlow turned back to find Samuel still standing there, hat in hand. The silent determination in his eyes spoke louder than words. He wasn't going anywhere. What she didn't know was that Samuel McKinnon had his own reasons for seeking work at the Tumbleweed Ranch, reasons that had nothing to do with wages and everything to do with a promise made to a dying man. By sunrise the next morning, Samuel was already mending the corral fence. Harlow watched from the kitchen window as he worked, his movements efficient and practiced. Her father had reluctantly agreed to let him stay. They couldn't pay wages, but could offer room and board until the ranch was back on its feet, or clearly beyond saving. "That boy's not here just for a job," her father had muttered between coughing fits. "Nobody works for nothing." Harlow had to agree. What would bring a young, capable cowboy like Samuel McKinnon to a failing ranch? And why would he stay without pay? Questions swirled in her mind as she turned back to the kitchen, where another problem awaited her. The pantry was nearly bare. A sack of flour, some dried beans, a few potatoes, and precious little else. Her father needed nourishing food to recover, but how could she provide it? Her mother had been a renowned cook whose meals had once drawn cowboys from 3 counties to the Tumbleweed. People used to joke that Martha O'Brien could turn leather into a feast fit for a king. Harlow's fingers found the folded recipe in her pocket. If only she could read her mother's words, unlock the secret that might save them all. The shame of her illiteracy burned hot in her chest. At 22 years old, she should have mastered such a basic skill, but circumstances had conspired against her. Her mother's early death, the remote location of the ranch, and her father's insistence that a woman's education was unnecessary. A knock at the back door startled her. Samuel stood there, a brace of rabbits in his hand. "Thought these might help with the supplies," he said, his eyes kind but careful not to linger too long on her face, as if he sensed her embarrassment. "Thank you," she said, taking them. Their fingers brushed, sending an unexpected warmth up her arm. "You didn't have to do that. Just earning my keep," he replied with a smile that transformed his face from merely handsome to something that made her heart skip a beat. He was young, perhaps 25, but his eyes held a wisdom beyond his years. As he turned to leave, Harlow called after him. "Mr. McKinnon." He paused, looking back over his shoulder. "Samuel, please. Or Sam. Samuel, she repeated, the name feeling right on her lips. Why are you really here? His expression shifted, something unreadable passing across his features. Everyone needs somewhere to belong, Miss O'Brien. Even if just for a little while. Before she could press further, he was gone, leaving Harlow with more questions than answers and a strange flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with worry. That evening, as she prepared a simple rabbit stew, Harlow felt the weight of the recipe in her pocket like a stone. Her mother's secret recipe for beef stew had once been famous throughout the territory. Cowboys would ride for days just to taste it. And in better times, the Tumbleweed had hosted regular suppers where Martha's cooking had been the star attraction. If she could recreate that recipe, perhaps she could revive the tradition. The ranch might earn enough to pay off their debts to Edward Caldwell, the banker who was all too eager to foreclose on their property. But the recipe remained a mystery, the letters dancing before her eyes like mocking sprites. Need help with anything? Samuel's voice startled her from her thoughts. He stood in the doorway, his tall frame nearly filling it, hat in hand. I'm fine, she said quickly, turning back to the stove. Samuel didn't press, but she felt his gaze linger on her. Your father mentioned your mother was quite the cook. Said her beef stew was legendary. Harlow stiffened. It was. My own mother was a fair hand in the kitchen, he continued, his voice soft with memory. She always said cooking was just another form of storytelling, each ingredient adding to the tale. When Harlow didn't respond, he added, I'll leave you to it, then. Just wanted to let you know I fixed the leak in the barn roof. After he left, Harlow slowly removed the recipe from her pocket, staring at it through a veil of tears. If cooking was storytelling, then this was a story she couldn't read. But perhaps, just perhaps, she could remember. Closing her eyes, she tried to recall watching her mother cook. The scents, the motions, the ingredients. Something stirred in her memory, not the recipe itself, but the feeling of being beside her mother at the stove, absorbing knowledge that transcended written words. What she didn't know was that Samuel had paused outside the door, watching her with an expression that mingled sympathy and something deeper. He had his own secrets to keep, his own promises to fulfill. And the mystery of Harlow O'Brien, the woman who stared at a recipe with such longing, was becoming as compelling as the task that had brought him to the Tumbleweed in the first place. 3 days later, Harlow stood at her father's bedside, worry creasing her brow. His fever had broken, but he remained weak, picking at the simple meals she prepared. Pa, you need to eat to get your strength back, she urged, offering a spoonful of broth. Thaddeus O'Brien turned his head away. What I need is a miracle, girl. Caldwell's giving us till the end of the month. Then we lose everything. Harlow's heart sank. The banker's latest letter had arrived that morning, delivered by his smug-faced clerk. 3 weeks to come up with $500, or the Tumbleweed would belong to Caldwell Holdings. We'll find a way, she insisted, though she had no idea how. Her father's weathered hand covered hers. Your mother would have known what to do. That woman could conjure gold from dust with those hands of hers. The mention of her mother sent Harlow's thoughts back to the recipe. She'd been experimenting in the kitchen, trying to recreate the famous stew from memory, but something was always missing, some secret ingredient or technique that made the difference between a good meal and an unforgettable one. Outside the bedroom window, she could see Samuel chopping wood, his shirt clinging to his broad shoulders as he worked in the afternoon heat. In just a few days, he'd repaired more around the ranch than her father had managed in months. The corral fence was mended, the barn roof no longer leaked, and he'd even coaxed their ancient well pump back to life. Yet for all his industry, Samuel McKinnon remained an enigma. Sometimes she caught him staring at the hills to the north with a faraway look, as if searching for something or someone. Other times, she'd find him studying her father with an intensity that went beyond concern for an employer. When her father finally dozed off, Harlow slipped outside. The late May sunshine warmed her face as she approached Samuel, who was stacking the split wood against the side of the house. My father's asleep, she said by way of greeting. Thank you for all this. Samuel straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. It's nothing. Your father needs time to heal, not worry about chores. And what do you need, Samuel McKinnon? The question slipped out before she could stop it. His eyes met hers, startled at her directness. What do you mean? Nobody works this hard for nothing. You've been here nearly a week without wages, fixing everything in sight and hunting game to fill our table. Harlow crossed her arms. What are you after? A muscle twitched in his jaw. Maybe I'm just a decent person. Maybe, she conceded. Or maybe you're hiding something. Samuel set down his axe, his expression guarded. We all have our secrets, Miss O'Brien. Even you. The pointed remark hit too close to home. Did he somehow know about her inability to read? Heat flooded her cheeks. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. 2 riders appeared on the road leading to the ranch. One she recognized immediately as Edward Caldwell, the banker. The other was his son, Henry, a preening peacock of a man who'd made unwelcome advances toward her at the last town social. Trouble, she muttered. Samuel moved slightly in front of her, a protective gesture that didn't go unnoticed. Friends of yours? The opposite. That's Edward Caldwell and his son. They hold the note on our ranch. The men dismounted, Caldwell's expensive boots raising dust as they hit the ground. In his fine suit and silk waistcoat, he looked absurdly out of place on a working ranch. Miss O'Brien, he called, his smile not reaching his cold eyes. I was in the area and thought I'd check on your father's health. I heard he's been poorly. How thoughtful, Harlow replied, her tone suggesting it was anything but. He's resting now. Caldwell's gaze shifted to Samuel, taking in his work-worn clothes and the axe leaning against the woodpile. And who might this be? Samuel McKinnon, sir. Samuel answered before Harlow could speak. I'm working for Mr. O'Brien. Henry Caldwell snorted. Working for promises instead of pay, I'd wager. The O'Briens are long on pride and short on funds. Samuel's expression remained neutral, but Harlow saw his hand tighten into a fist at his side. Now, Henry, the elder Caldwell chided, though his smile suggested he shared his son's sentiment. I'm sure Miss O'Brien is doing her best under difficult circumstances. He turned his attention back to Harlow. Perhaps we could discuss those circumstances over dinner? I've taken the liberty of making reservations at the hotel in town for Saturday next. My treat, of course. The implication was clear. Dinner would come with strings attached. Strings that might save the ranch, but at a cost Harlow wasn't willing to pay. That's very generous, she said carefully. But I couldn't possibly leave my father. I'm sure your hired hand could look after him for one evening. Caldwell's gaze flicked dismissively to Samuel. Think about it, my dear. There are ways to resolve your situation that could benefit us both. As the Caldwells rode away, Harlow felt a chill despite the warm day. She'd seen the predatory glint in Edward Caldwell's eyes, the same look he gave when appraising property he intended to acquire. That man wants more than your ranch, Samuel observed quietly. He'll get neither, Harlow replied, her voice stronger than she felt. Samuel studied her face for a long moment. You need money fast. $500 by the end of the month, or we lose everything. A thoughtful expression crossed his face. Your father mentioned something about your mother's cooking drawing crowds, that people would pay good money for a meal here. Harlow's hand unconsciously moved to her pocket where the recipe resided. That was a long time ago. Maybe it's time to try again. Samuel's eyes lit up with inspiration. A supper, like in the old days. Charge a fair price. Invite folks from all around. If your mother's cooking was as legendary as your father claims, people will come. Hope flickered briefly in Harlow's chest before reality doused it. I can't. I don't know how to make it right. But you have her recipe, don't you? The question hung in the air between them. Harlow felt trapped, caught between admitting her shameful secret and lying outright. It's complicated, she finally said. Samuel stepped closer, his voice gentle. Harlow, whatever's holding you back, whatever's complicated, I'd like to help. If you'll let me. The sound of her given name on his lips sent an unexpected warmth through her. For a wild moment, she considered confessing everything. Her inability to read, her desperate attempts to recreate her mother's recipe, the growing feelings for this mysterious man that she couldn't quite explain. Instead, she took a step back. I need to check on my father. As she hurried toward the house, Samuel called after her. Everyone needs help sometimes, Harlow. Even you. She didn't turn around, afraid he might see the truth written plainly on her face. But his words followed her inside, echoing in her mind along with a growing suspicion that Samuel McKinnon might be the only person who could help her now, if she dared to trust him with her secret. What she didn't know was that Samuel was harboring a far more consequential secret of his own, one that would soon force them both to decide what mattered most, the past they were hiding from or the future they might build together. Samuel sat on the porch steps that evening, whittling a piece of pine as the setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. The events of the day weighed heavily on his mind. Caldwell's thinly veiled threats, Harlow's stubborn independence, and the secret he himself kept hidden like a loaded gun. He'd come to the Tumbleweed with a purpose that had nothing to do with saving a struggling ranch. Now, each day that passed tangled him further in the lives of the O'Briens, especially the copper-haired woman whose green eyes held both strength and vulnerability in equal measure. The screen door creaked behind him. Harlow emerged, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to him without a word, then settled beside him on the steps, careful to maintain a proper distance. "Pa's fever hasn't returned," she said, staring out at the darkening land. "The doctor says that's a good sign." Samuel nodded. "He's tough. O'Briens don't give up easily, from what I've seen." A ghost of a smile crossed her face. Stubbornness runs in the family. They sat in companionable silence for a while, sipping their coffee as the first stars appeared above. "I've been thinking about your supper idea," Harlow finally said. "It might work if—" She stopped, searching for words. "If," Samuel prompted gently. Harlow set her cup down, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. "If I could make my mother's stew properly. People used to ride for days just to taste it. They said it had healing properties. That's why they called her the medicine woman of Sweetwater Creek, even though she wasn't an actual healer." "Do you remember how she made it?" "Bits and pieces. I was young when she passed, just 14. I helped her in the kitchen, but—" Harlow's voice trailed off. Samuel waited, sensing there was more she wanted to say. When she remained silent, he offered, "My father used to say that the best recipes aren't written down, they're felt. In here." He tapped his chest over his heart. "Your father sounds wise." "He was," Samuel said quietly, the past tense hanging between them. After a moment, he added, "I could help you, you know. I'm not much of a cook, but 4 hands are better than 2. Harlow turned to look at him, her expression unreadable in the gathering darkness. "Why are you really here, Samuel? And don't tell me it's just for room and board." The directness of her question caught him off guard. He could deflect again, offer another half-truth, but something in her voice, a raw honesty that matched the vulnerability in her eyes, made him want to give her at least part of the truth. "I made a promise to someone," he said slowly. "Someone who once knew your father." "Who?" "A man I met in Denver. He was dying and asked me to check on Thaddeus O'Brien. It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't a lie either." Harlow studied him. "There's more to it than that." Samuel met her gaze steadily. "Yes, but I'm not ready to share that part yet." To his surprise, she nodded. "Fair enough. We all have our reasons for keeping secrets." The admission hung in the air between them, an unexpected bridge of understanding. "About that supper," Samuel said, changing the subject. "If we start planning now, we could hold it in 2 weeks. That still leaves time to try again if the first one doesn't raise enough." Harlow's expression clouded. "I don't know if I can do it." "You're not alone anymore," Samuel said quietly. "Whatever's holding you back, we'll face it together." The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken words and growing feelings neither was ready to acknowledge. Harlow stood abruptly, gathering their empty cups. "I should get some rest," she said. "Morning comes early." As she reached the door, she paused. "Samuel? Thank you for helping, even if you have your own reasons." After she disappeared inside, Samuel remained on the porch, staring at the stars. He'd come to the Tumbleweed seeking answers about his own past. Instead, he'd found Harlow O'Brien, a woman whose present troubles were becoming more important to him than the history he'd traveled so far to uncover. And that realization was as terrifying as it was exhilarating. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Harlow rose early, her mind made up. If they were going to host a supper to save the ranch, she needed to face her shame and ask for help. But first, she had to try once more on her own. In the quiet kitchen, she spread her mother's recipe on the table and stared at it, willing the mysterious marks to resolve into words she could understand. Her finger traced the faded ink, following the curves and lines that held the secret to her mother's famous stew. So absorbed was she in her futile task that she didn't hear Samuel enter until he spoke. "Good morning," he said, his voice soft so as not to startle her. Harlow jumped anyway, her hand instinctively covering the recipe. Samuel, I didn't hear you. His eyes flickered to her hand on the paper, then back to her face. Sorry to intrude. I was hoping to fetch some coffee before starting on the south pasture fence. Of course, she said, quickly folding the recipe and tucking it away. She busied herself with the coffee pot, keeping her back to him as she tried to compose herself. When she turned around, coffee in hand, she found Samuel watching her with a thoughtful expression. Harlow, he said gently, I can't help but notice you have a recipe there that seems important to you. She handed him the cup, avoiding his eyes. It's nothing. It's not nothing if it's causing you this much distress. His voice remained kind, without judgment. Is that your mother's stew recipe? Harlow felt cornered, her secret pressing against her like a physical weight. The shame of it, a grown woman unable to read, threatened to overwhelm her. Yes, she admitted, her voice barely audible. Samuel set his cup down and took a step toward her, stopping when she tensed. Harlow, I don't mean to pry, but can you read that recipe? The question hung in the air between them, direct and unavoidable. Harlow felt tears spring to her eyes, hot with humiliation. She turned away, unwilling to let him see her weakness. No, she whispered. I can't. The admission cost her dearly. She braced herself for his reaction. Pity, perhaps, or worse, disdain. Instead, she felt his hand, warm and steady, touch her shoulder. Thank you for trusting me with that. Surprised, she turned to face him. There was no pity in his eyes, only understanding. You don't think less of me? She asked, her voice small. For what? Not having the opportunity to learn. Samuel shook his head. My own sister didn't learn to read until she was 16. Our family was always on the move. Education wasn't always possible. Relief washed over Harlow, so powerful she felt her knees weaken. I've tried to hide it for so long. After Mother died, there was no one to teach me. Pa didn't see the need for a girl to read, and we were too far from town for regular schooling. But you kept your mother's recipe all this time, Samuel observed, hoping someday you could use it. Harlow nodded. It's all I have left of her. When she was dying, she pressed it into my hands and made me promise to keep it safe. This recipe saved us once, she said. It might save you again someday. Samuel's expression softened. May I see it? Hesitantly, Harlow withdrew the folded parchment from her pocket and handed it to him. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, sending an unexpected warmth through her. Samuel unfolded the recipe carefully, as if handling a precious relic. His eyes scanned the faded writing, his brow furrowing slightly as he read. Well, Harlow asked anxiously, can you read it? Most of it, he replied. Your mother's handwriting is elegant but faint in places. From what I can make out, it's definitely a beef stew recipe, but... He paused, studying one section more closely. What is it? Samuel looked up, a mixture of confusion and intrigue on his face. There's an ingredient here I don't recognize. Or rather, it's written in a way that suggests it's special somehow. Harlow moved closer, peering at the paper though she couldn't decipher it. What does it say? Heart of the earth, born of fire, Samuel read. The secret that makes the ordinary extraordinary. And below that, there's a symbol, almost like a drawing of a flower or plant. That sounds like my mother, Harlow said, a bittersweet smile touching her lips. She always said cooking was part science, part magic. Do you have any idea what this ingredient might be? Harlow closed her eyes, trying to summon memories of her mother in the kitchen. She used to keep a special tin on the highest shelf. I wasn't allowed to touch it. When she added whatever was inside to her stew, she'd always turn her back, so I couldn't see exactly what it was or how much she used. Samuel carefully refolded the recipe. We need to find that tin. After all these years, it's probably long gone. Maybe not. People keep important things, often in the same places. His eyes lit up with determination. Where did your mother store her special ingredients? In the root cellar, Harlow replied. There's a shelf built into the far wall where she kept things away from dampness and pests. Without another word, Samuel headed for the door, his coffee forgotten. Harlow hurried after him, hope and skepticism warring in her chest. The root cellar was cool and dim, accessed by a trapdoor outside the kitchen. Samuel descended the rough wooden steps first, offering his hand to help Harlow down. The earthen walls were lined with shelves holding preserves, root vegetables, and dried goods. There, Harlow pointed to a narrow shelf built into the far wall. That's where she kept her special ingredients. Samuel approached the shelf, which stood just above his eye level. Dust and cobwebs suggested it hadn't been disturbed in years. With careful hands, he began examining the items, mostly empty containers and a few sealed jars of unidentifiable contents. "Wait," Harlow said suddenly. "The shelf itself, Mother always said to look beyond the obvious." Samuel ran his fingers along the underside of the wooden shelf, his expression changing as he felt something. "There's a compartment here." A small panel slid open, revealing a hidden space just large enough to hold a single object. A small tin box, tarnished with age but still intact. Harlow gasped. "That's it. That's her special tin." Samuel carefully removed the box and handed it to Harlow. Her hands trembled as she held this tangible connection to her mother. The tin was surprisingly heavy for its size. "Open it," Samuel urged gently. Harlow worked the lid free. Inside, nestled in a scrap of faded cloth, was a small drawstring pouch. She opened it carefully, revealing a reddish-brown powder with a sharp, distinctive aroma. "What is it?" Samuel asked, leaning close. Harlow inhaled deeply, the scent triggering a flood of memories. "I know this smell. It's the secret ingredient. Mother called it her miracle spice." Samuel dipped a finger into the powder and tasted a tiny amount. His eyes widened. "It's some kind of pepper, but unlike any I've tasted before. Earthy, smoky, with a slow heat that builds rather than burns." "Can you read the recipe fully now? With this, could we recreate my mother's stew?" "We can try," Samuel said, his smile warming her more than his words. "And maybe save the ranch in the process." As they climbed back into the sunlight, Harlow felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. Not just for the ranch, but for herself. In Samuel McKinnon, she'd found not judgment for her inability to read, but acceptance and partnership. What neither of them realized as they returned to the kitchen, heads bent together over the ancient recipe and mysterious spice, was that they were embarking on more than a culinary journey. They were taking the first steps toward healing not only the Tumbleweed Ranch, but their own wounded hearts as well. And in the process, they were drawing ever closer to a revelation that would test everything they thought they knew about each other, about family, and about the true meaning of legacy. Word spread quickly through Sweetwater Creek and the surrounding area. A supper at the Tumbleweed Ranch, the first in nearly a decade, featuring Martha O'Brien's legendary beef stew. The mysterious dish that had once drawn cowboys, ranchers, and travelers from miles around was being served again, prepared by her daughter. For 3 days, Harlow and Samuel worked side by side in the kitchen, deciphering the recipe and experimenting with the mysterious spice. Samuel read the instructions aloud, patiently explaining each step, while Harlow contributed her memories of watching her mother cook. She always browned the meat very slowly, Harlow recalled, hovering over the cast-iron pot where chunks of beef sizzled. And she'd add the onions only when the meat was just right, not too dark, not too light. Samuel leaned against the counter, watching her work with admiration. "You know more than you give yourself credit for. Your hands remember what your eyes couldn't read." A blush colored Harlow's cheeks at his praise. "Let's hope it's enough." The first test batch was good, but not extraordinary, certainly not the miraculous stew of legend. The second attempt came closer, with Samuel suggesting they let it simmer longer to develop the flavors. By the third try, using a careful measure of the mysterious spice, which they'd taken to calling Martha's Fire, they created something that made Thaddeus O'Brien push himself upright in his sickbed, his eyes wide with wonder. "That's it," he whispered after tasting a spoonful. "That's Martha's stew. How did you?" His voice broke with emotion. Harlow squeezed her father's hand. "Mother left us the recipe, Pa. And her secret ingredient, too. Always was a clever woman, your mother," he said, his eyes damp. "Too clever for the likes of me, but she loved me anyway." As the day of the supper approached, Samuel rode into town to spread the word further and purchase additional supplies. When he returned, he brought unexpected news. "The Caldwells are coming," he announced as he unloaded sacks of potatoes and flour from the wagon. "Both of them." Harlow's heart sank, probably hoping to see us fail. Or worse, to gloat about taking the ranch. "Or maybe they've heard about Martha's legendary stew and are curious," Samuel suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. "Either way, Their money spends the same as anyone else's. The day before the supper, while Harlow was preparing vegetables in the kitchen, Samuel disappeared into the barn. He emerged hours later, covered in sawdust, but wearing a satisfied expression. "What have you been doing?" Harlow asked. "Making tables," he replied. "Your mother used to serve 20 or 30 people at these suppers, according to your father. We'll need seating." Harlow stepped outside to see 5 sturdy trestle tables arranged in the yard, with benches to match. Samuel had created a dining area beneath the old cottonwood tree, where lanterns could be hung from the branches to provide light as evening fell. "You did all this today?" she marveled. Samuel shrugged, but couldn't hide his pleased expression. "I had most of it cut already. Just needed assembling." He glanced at her flour-dusted apron. "How's the bread coming?" 6 loaves cooling, 6 more in the oven." She brushed a strand of copper hair from her face, leaving a smudge of flour on her cheek. Without thinking, Samuel reached out and gently wiped it away with his thumb. The simple touch sent electricity through them both. For a moment, they stood frozen, his hand lingering near her face, her eyes wide with surprise. Samuel cleared his throat and stepped back. "I should clean up before supper." Harlow nodded, unable to form words as she watched him walk toward the bunkhouse, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the setting sun. That night, as she lay in bed, Harlow found herself thinking not of the next day's supper or the ranch's precarious future, but of Samuel McKinnon, his gentle hands, his patient teaching, his unwavering support. In just 2 weeks, he'd become essential to her in ways she couldn't have imagined when he first rode onto the Tumbleweed. But the question remained. Once the ranch was saved, if it could be saved, would he stay? Or would he move on, his mysterious promise fulfilled? The thought of him leaving created an ache in her chest that surprised her with its intensity. Somehow, without her noticing, Samuel had carved out a place in her heart. And tomorrow, as they served her mother's stew to a yard full of paying customers, Harlow would be fighting not just for her father's ranch, but for a future that increasingly seemed empty without Samuel in it. The day of the supper dawned clear and mild, a perfect late spring day. By noon, the aroma of simmering stew filled the Tumbleweed's kitchen. 3 enormous iron pots bubbled on the stove and in the fireplace, each containing Martha O'Brien's famous recipe, complete with the mysterious spice that gave it its legendary quality. Samuel had ridden into town one last time to collect the final responses and payment from those who had reserved places. When he returned, his expression was a mixture of excitement and concern. 42 people, he announced as he entered the kitchen. "That's more than we planned for." Harlow looked up from where she was kneading another batch of dough, her arms dusted with flour to the elbows. 42? Can we feed that many? If we stretch the stew with more vegetables and serve slightly smaller portions, yes. I bought extra potatoes and carrots. He set a pouch on the table. And I collected payment in advance from most, $35 so far. Hope flickered in Harlow's chest. At $1 per person for the supper, they needed $500 to pay off Caldwell. With 42 confirmed and the possibility of more arriving unannounced, they might come close with this first event. "We'll need to host at least one more supper," she said, calculating mentally. "Maybe 2. One step at a time," Samuel replied, rolling up his sleeves. "Let's make this one a success first." As evening approached, they worked in tandem, moving around each other in the kitchen with the synchronicity of longtime partners. Harlow couldn't help but notice how naturally they fit together, anticipating each other's needs without words. Her father, feeling stronger, insisted on sitting on the porch to greet guests as they arrived. Dressed in his good shirt and string tie, with his white hair combed neatly, Thaddeus O'Brien looked more like his old self than he had in months. The first wagon arrived just before 6 o'clock, the Millers from the neighboring ranch, followed quickly by the Johnsons and the Perkins family. Soon the yard was filled with horses, wagons, and townspeople in their Sunday best, all drawn by the promise of Martha O'Brien's legendary stew. Samuel directed guests to the tables, while Harlow remained in the kitchen, making final preparations. Through the window, she watched as he charmed the arrivals, his easy smile and attentive manner putting everyone at ease. She felt a surge of gratitude for his presence, for everything he'd done to make this evening possible. A murmur rippled through the crowd as another arrival drew attention. Edward Caldwell and his son Henry approached in their fine carriage, dressed as if for a society dinner rather than a ranch supper. "Miss O'Brien," Caldwell called as he spotted Harlow emerging from the kitchen with a basket of bread. "What a charming scene. Almost like the old days, I hear." "Mr. Caldwell," she acknowledged coolly. "Your table is over there." "I do hope this little enterprise succeeds," he said, his tone suggesting the opposite. "Though I wonder if one supper can possibly raise the sum you need by the end of the month." Before Harlow could respond, Samuel appeared at her side, his presence solid and reassuring. "The stew's ready," he said to her, before turning to Caldwell with a polite but distant smile. "Evening, sir. Glad you could make it." Caldwell's eyes narrowed as he looked between them. "Quite the helpful hand you found, Miss O'Brien." One might wonder at his motivation. "One might mind one's own business," Samuel replied pleasantly, though Harlow felt him tense beside her. The banker's smile thinned. "Everything in Sweetwater Creek is my business, young man. You'd do well to remember that." As Caldwell moved away to join his son at their table, Harlow let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "He's trying to provoke us." "Let him try," Samuel said. "Tonight isn't about Caldwell. It's about your mother's legacy and the future of this ranch." With that, they began serving. Samuel ladled the rich, fragrant stew into bowls, while Harlow distributed them to the guests along with thick slices of fresh bread. The yard fell quieter as people began to eat, the only sounds the clink of spoons and murmurs of appreciation. Harlow held her breath, watching faces for reactions. Had they truly captured her mother's recipe? Would it live up to the legend? She didn't have to wait long for an answer. Old Tom Jenkins, who had been coming to the Tumbleweed supper since before Harlow was born, took one taste and closed his eyes, a look of pure bliss crossing his weathered face. "It's exactly the same," he declared, his voice carrying across the yard. "Like Martha herself made it. Girl, you've done your mother proud." A ripple of agreement spread through the diners. People began sharing memories of previous suppers, of Martha O'Brien's kindness and her miraculous stew that somehow tasted like home, no matter where you were from. Even the Caldwells couldn't maintain their disdain. Harlow noticed Henry take a second helping when he thought no one was watching, and Edward's expression of reluctant appreciation as he sopped up the last of his stew with a piece of bread. As the evening progressed and lanterns were lit in the cottonwood tree, a sense of community enveloped the gathering. Someone produced a fiddle, and impromptu dancing began on the packed earth beside the tables. Children chased fireflies at the edge of the yard, and the older folks shared stories of the early days in Sweetwater Creek. Amid the celebration, Harlow found herself watching Samuel. He moved among the guests with easy confidence, refilling bowls, answering questions, making everyone feel welcome. It was as if he'd always belonged here, as if the Tumbleweed was as much his home as hers. The thought both warmed and terrified her. In just 2 weeks, he'd become indispensable. What would happen when he inevitably moved on? As if sensing her gaze, Samuel looked up and met her eyes across the yard. The smile he gave her, private and warm, meant for her alone, made her heart skip a beat. She was falling in love with Samuel McKinnon. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. Worse, she had no idea if he felt the same, or if his kindness was simply part of his nature, or his mysterious promise to someone from her father's past. Before she could dwell on this uncomfortable revelation, a commotion at the edge of the gathering drew everyone's attention. A man on horseback had arrived, his mount lathered from hard riding. "Is Thaddeus O'Brien here?" the rider called, scanning the crowd. Harlow's father stood from his chair on the porch. "I'm Thaddeus O'Brien." The rider dismounted quickly. "Message for you, sir." "From Denver." Man said it was urgent. A hush fell over the gathering as Thaddeus took the envelope and broke the seal. His eyes scanned the contents, his face growing pale. "Pa." Harlow moved toward him, concern tightening her chest. "What is it?" Her father looked up, his expression stunned. "It's from James Ryder." Samuel, who had been approaching to see if he could help, stopped abruptly at the mention of the name. Harlow saw him go very still, his face draining of color. "James is coming here," Thaddeus continued, his voice shaking slightly. "Says he has important news that couldn't wait." "That's impossible," Samuel said, the words seemingly torn from him. All eyes turned to him, including Harlow's. "What do you mean?" she asked. Samuel's gaze met hers, his expression a complex mixture of shock and something that looked almost like guilt. James Ryder died 3 weeks ago in Denver. I know because I was with him when he passed. A shocked murmur ran through the crowd. Thaddeus O'Brien's hand holding the letter began to tremble visibly. That can't be, he said. This letter is dated 5 days ago. Who is James Ryder? Harlow demanded, looking between her father and Samuel, sensing a connection she hadn't known existed. Her father sank heavily back into his chair. He's an old friend. We had a falling out many years ago. What kind of falling out? Harlow pressed, a strange foreboding gripping her. Before her father could answer, Samuel stepped forward, his face set in grim lines. James Ryder was my mother's brother, my uncle, and the last thing he asked of me before he died was to find Thaddeus O'Brien and deliver a message. The revelation hung in the air like summer lightning. Harlow felt as if the ground beneath her feet had suddenly shifted. You're James Ryder's nephew? Thaddeus asked, his voice barely audible. Annie's boy. Samuel nodded, his eyes never leaving the older man's face. Yes, sir. Though I never expected to find what I did when I came here. And what was that? Harlow asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Samuel turned to her, his expression softening. You, he said simply. I never expected to find you. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken emotions and questions. Around them, the supper guests watched in fascinated silence, sensing they were witnessing something significant. Edward Caldwell, never one to miss an opportunity, broke the tension. How dramatically convenient, he said, his voice carrying across the yard. A mysterious message from a dead man and a convenient connection between Mr. McKinnon and the O'Briens. One might wonder if this isn't all an elaborate scheme. Hold your tongue, Caldwell. Thaddeus snapped with more strength than he'd shown in months. This is family business. The word family seemed to echo in the silence that followed. Harlow looked from her father to Samuel and back again, a suspicion forming in her mind that she could scarcely bring herself to contemplate. Huh, she said slowly. What aren't you telling me? Who is James Ryder to us? Thaddeus O'Brien looked at his daughter, his weathered face lined with years of kept secrets. He was my business partner, once. And my friend. Until I betrayed him. Betrayed him how? Harlow demanded. Her father's eyes filled with tears. By marrying the woman he loved. Your mother. The revelation rippled through the gathering like a stone dropped in still water. Harlow felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Before she could process this new information, Samuel spoke again, his voice quiet, but carrying clearly in the hushed yard. That's only part of the truth, he said. The message my uncle asked me to deliver was a forgiveness, not an accusation. And there's more, something he wanted Thaddeus to know before he died. What more could there possibly be? Harlow asked, a tremor in her voice. Samuel's eyes met hers, filled with a compassion that made her heart clench with foreboding. My uncle wanted your father to know that he never blamed him for choosing Martha. That in the end, she made the right choice for all of them. All of them, Harlow repeated, confused. Yes, Samuel said gently, because Martha was carrying a child when she chose between them. A child that James knew wasn't his, but Thaddeus's. You, Harlow. The world seemed to hold its breath as this final piece fell into place. Harlow turned to her father, seeking confirmation or denial. Thaddeus O'Brien sat with his head bowed, tears streaming unchecked down his face. It's true, he whispered. Your mother was already carrying you when we married. James knew, and he stepped aside. I thought he hated me for it all these years. He didn't, Samuel said. He wanted you to know that, and he wanted me to give you this. He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded document. It's the deed to a silver mine in Colorado. James's final bequest to his oldest friend and to his friend's daughter. As the implications of this revelation settled over the gathering, Harlow felt as if she were standing outside herself, watching a story unfold that both was and wasn't her own. The ranch, her mother's recipe, Samuel's arrival, all pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known needed solving. And at the center of it all, a love triangle from before she was born that had shaped her entire existence. The Tumbleweed supper guests, sensing they were witnessing a deeply private moment, began to quietly disperse, leaving generous payment and heartfelt thanks as they departed. Even the Caldwells withdrew, though Edward paused long enough to say, "This isn't over, O'Brien. A dead man's mind claim changes nothing about your debt to me." Only when the last guest had gone did Harlow allow herself to fully feel the weight of all she'd learned. She turned to Samuel, the man who'd come into her life like a whirlwind and upended everything she thought she knew. "You came here because of a promise to your uncle," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "Not to help save the ranch or teach me to read. You had a message to deliver." Samuel stepped toward her, his eyes pleading for understanding. "Yes, that's why I came. But it's not why I stayed." Before she could ask what he meant, her father spoke from his chair on the porch. "Girl, don't blame the boy. The fault is mine for keeping secrets all these years." Harlow looked between the two men, her father, who had hidden the truth of her birth, and Samuel, who had hidden the reason for his arrival. Both had kept pieces of her own story from her, as if she were a child to be protected rather than a woman with the right to know her own history. "I need time," she said finally. "Time to understand all this." Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked toward the darkened fields beyond the yard, needing space to breathe, to think, to reconcile the life she'd thought she lived with the reality that had been revealed. Behind her, Samuel started to follow, only to be stopped by Thaddeus's hand on his arm. "Let her go, son," the older man said quietly. "She's got O'Brien steel in her spine. She'll come back when she's ready." As Harlow disappeared into the darkness, Samuel could only watch, wondering if in fulfilling his promise to his uncle, he had destroyed his chance at a future with the woman he'd come to love. What neither man knew was that Harlow was carrying something with her as she walked away. Her mother's recipe and the mysterious spice that had, for one night at least, brought the tumbleweed back to life. And in those two items lay not just the past, but perhaps the future as well, a future that would require all three of them to reckon with truths long buried and possibilities newly born. Dawn found Harlow sitting on the riverbank, her knees drawn to her chest as she watched the first light touch the eastern sky. She'd spent the night walking, thinking, occasionally crying, but mostly just trying to absorb the seismic shift in her understanding of her own life. Her mother's recipe lay unfolded beside her, the mysterious spice pouch resting on top of it. In the growing light, she studied the writing she couldn't read, tracing the familiar loops and curves with her fingertip. "I wish you'd told me," she whispered, as if her mother might somehow hear. "About James Ryder. About Pa. About all of it." The recipe offered no answers, but as Harlow stared at it, something caught her eye, a small drawing in the margin she hadn't noticed before. It appeared to be a flower or plant, similar to the one Samuel had mentioned, but with more detail visible in the morning light. She picked up the paper, examining the drawing more closely. There was something familiar about it, something that tugged at her memory. The plant had slender leaves and what looked like small, round fruit or berries. Suddenly, it clicked. She'd seen this plant growing along the riverbank, had even helped her mother harvest it as a child. They'd called it fireberry for the way it heated the mouth when tasted. Excited by this connection to her past, Harlow scanned the riverbank until she spotted a patch of the distinctive foliage. The berries weren't yet ripe. It was too early in the season, but the leaves themselves had a spicy scent when crushed. A realization dawned on her. The mysterious spice in the tin wasn't imported or exotic. It was made from these plants that grew right here on Tumbleweed land. Her mother had created her famous ingredient from what the earth provided freely. "The heart of the earth, born of fire," Harlow murmured, recalling the words from the recipe. "The secret that makes the ordinary extraordinary." With this new understanding came another thought. If these plants grew here naturally, the tumbleweed possessed something valuable beyond the deed to a silver mine. They had the source of Martha O'Brien's legendary spice, a flavor that couldn't be found anywhere else. The sun had fully risen by the time Harlow returned to the ranch. As she approached, she saw Samuel sitting alone on the porch steps, his head in his hands. He looked up at the sound of her footsteps, relief washing over his face when he saw her. He stood quickly but didn't approach, respecting the distance she'd needed. "Harlow," he said, her name a question and a plea rolled into one. She stopped a few feet away, studying him in the clear morning light. Despite everything, her heart still quickened at the sight of him. "I found something," she said, holding up the plant cutting she'd taken from the riverbank. Samuel's brow furrowed in confusion. "What is it?" "The source of my mother's secret ingredient. It grows wild here, along the river. I remember helping her harvest it as a child." Harlow took a deep breath. The tumbleweed isn't just a ranch, Samuel. It's the only place in the world where this plant grows. At least, according to my mother. Understanding dawned in his eyes. That's why the stew was so special. It wasn't just the recipe. It was an ingredient unique to this land. Harlow nodded. My mother knew. That's why she told me the recipe might save us someday. Not just the recipe itself, but what it represents, something that belongs only to the tumbleweed. They stood in silence for a moment, the significance of this discovery hanging between them. Harlow, about last night, Samuel began. Why didn't you tell me the truth from the beginning? She interrupted. About who you were, why you came here. Samuel ran a hand through his hair, his expression troubled. At first, I wasn't sure how to approach it. I'd promised my uncle I'd deliver his message and the mine deed to your father, but when I arrived and found the ranch struggling, your father ill. He shook his head. It seemed cruel to announce myself as James Ryder's nephew without understanding the situation first. And later, Harlow pressed, after we began working together, after I trusted you with my own secret? I was afraid, he admitted, the words clearly costing him. Afraid that once you knew why I'd come, you'd see everything else, my helping with the supper, teaching you to read the recipe, as just a means to an end. And it wasn't, Harlow. It became so much more than fulfilling a promise to a dying man. What did it become then? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Samuel took a step toward her, then another, closing the distance between them. It became about you, about your father, about this place. His eyes held hers, earnest and vulnerable. Somewhere along the way, the tumbleweed started feeling like home. And you became someone I couldn't imagine leaving behind when my task was done. Harlow's heart thundered in her chest. And is your task done now? Will you leave? That depends, he said softly. On what? On whether there's a reason for me to stay. His voice dropped lower, intimate in the morning quiet. Is there, Harlow? She looked at him. This man who had ridden into her life with a secret purpose but had stayed to help save everything she loved. Despite his omissions, he had been nothing but supportive, patient, and kind. He had accepted her inability to read without judgment, had worked alongside her to recreate her mother's legacy, had become, in a matter of weeks, as essential to her as breathing. Yes, she said finally. There's a reason. Relief and joy flooded his expression. He reached for her hands, holding them gently in his own. I should have told you everything from the start. I'm sorry for that. But I'm not sorry I came here, and I'm not sorry for what I've found. And what have you found, Samuel McKinnon? Harlow asked, though she thought she knew the answer from the way he was looking at her. A place to belong, he said, and a woman to love, if she'll have me. The words hung in the air between them, a declaration and a question. Harlow felt tears prick behind her eyes, not of sadness or confusion this time, but of a joy so intense it almost hurt. She will, she whispered. On one condition. Name it. No more secrets. Not between us. Harlow squeezed his hands. I've had enough of those for a lifetime. Samuel nodded solemnly. No more secrets. I promise. Then he smiled. That warm smile that had first begun to melt her heart weeks ago. Though I should warn you, I'm planning to ask your father for permission to court you properly, and that might not be a secret I can keep for long. Harlow laughed, the sound releasing weeks of tension. I think Pa would approve. He seems to think you have O'Brien steel in your spine, too. High praise indeed, Samuel said, his eyes twinkling. Then his expression grew serious again. What about Caldwell and the loan? The supper brought in almost $70, but that's still not enough. We have the deed to the mine, Harlow reminded him. And we know now that the tumbleweed has something unique, the source of my mother's special ingredient. Between those things and another supper next week, I believe we can convince Caldwell that foreclosing would be a poor business decision. Samuel's smile returned, proud and warm. Martha O'Brien's daughter through and through. Smart as she is beautiful. Before Harlow could respond, the front door opened and Thaddeus O'Brien stepped onto the porch. He looked between them, noting their clasped hands and the minimal distance between them, and nodded once. So you've worked things out, I see, he said, his gruff voice betraying a hint of approval. We're getting there, Pa, Harlow replied. I found something this morning you should know about. She held up the plant cutting. Remember how Mother used to harvest these along the river? This is the secret ingredient in her stew. It only grows here, on Tumbleweed land. Her father's eyebrows rose in surprise. I'll be damned. Martha always said this land was special. He looked at Samuel. Your uncle thought so too. It's why they both wanted it, back in the day. Not just for ranching, but for what grows here naturally. James knew about the plant. Samuel asked. Thaddeus nodded. He was the one who first noticed its unique properties. He and Martha experimented with it together before. He trailed off, old memories clouding his eyes. Well, before everything changed. Is that why he wanted you to have the silver mine? Harlow asked. As a kind of exchange for the tumbleweed? Perhaps, her father said thoughtfully. James always did think in terms of balance. A debt owed, a debt repaid. He looked at Samuel. Your uncle was a good man, son. Better than I deserved as a friend. He thought highly of you, sir, Samuel replied. Even at the end, he wanted to make sure you and Harlow would be all right. Thaddeus nodded, emotion making it difficult for him to speak. After a moment, he cleared his throat and straightened his shoulders. Well then, seems to me we have work to do. Caldwell will be back, mind deed or no mind deed. We need to be ready. We will be, Pa, Harlow said with newfound confidence. Together, as they moved into the house to begin planning their next steps, Harlow felt a sense of rightness settle over her. The secrets of the past had been revealed, painful though they were. What remained was the future, a future that included Samuel, the tumbleweed, and her mother's legacy. And perhaps most importantly, it included the truth about who she was, where she came from, and what she was capable of. The cook who couldn't read had indeed saved the ranch with her mother's secret recipe. But in doing so, she discovered something far more valuable than a culinary secret or even a silver mine. She discovered herself. 1 year later, the Tumbleweed Ranch glowed with lantern light as the sun set behind the western hills. Long tables arranged beneath the cottonwood tree groaned under the weight of food, the centerpiece a massive iron pot of Martha O'Brien's famous stew. The aroma filled the air, drawing appreciative comments from the assembled guests, friends, neighbors, and travelers who had come to experience what was now a monthly tradition. Harlow moved among the tables, greeting guests and refilling bread baskets. Her copper hair was arranged in a simple but elegant knot at the nape of her neck, complementing the new blue dress she wore for the occasion. As she worked, her eyes frequently sought out Samuel, who was deep in conversation with Edward Caldwell near the corral. Unlike the tense exchanges of a year ago, the two men now spoke as business partners. After the revelations of James Ryder's bequest and the discovery of the unique plant that grew only on tumbleweed land, Caldwell had been persuaded to see the ranch in a new light, not as property to foreclose upon, but as an opportunity for investment. The monthly suppers had become renowned throughout the territory, drawing visitors from as far as Denver. The demand for Martha's special spice, now packaged in small tins and sold as tumbleweed fire, had created a steady income beyond the cattle operation. And the silver mine, while not as productive as in its heyday, provided enough additional revenue to ensure the ranch's stability. Thaddeus O'Brien sat in his customary place on the porch, looking healthier than he had in years. Beside him was a leather-bound book, one of many Harlow had been practicing with over the past year. Her reading skills had improved steadily under Samuel's patient tutelage, and while she still struggled with complex texts, she could now read her mother's recipe without assistance. As the evening's festivities reached their peak, Samuel excused himself from Caldwell and made his way to Harlow's side. His clean-shaven face broke into a warm smile as he approached. "Everything's perfect," he said, taking her hand briefly and giving it a gentle squeeze. "Your mother would be proud." "Our mothers," Harlow corrected him with a smile. "I like to think they both would have approved of how things turned out." Samuel's expression softened. "I believe they would." He glanced around to ensure they weren't being overheard, then lowered his voice. "Is everything ready for later?" Harlow nodded, excitement fluttering in her chest. "Pa knows to make the announcement after dessert. Though I still don't understand why we're doing it this way instead of just telling people ourselves. Because your father has been waiting a year to stand up in front of everyone and declare that his daughter is marrying James Ryder's nephew," Samuel replied with a chuckle. "It's his way of bringing the whole story full circle." "I suppose you're right," Harlow conceded. Her fingers unconsciously touched the simple gold ring that hung from a chain around her neck, Samuel's mother's ring. which would soon move from its hiding place to her left hand once their engagement was announced. Their courtship had progressed steadily over the past year, weathering the challenges of rebuilding the ranch and establishing their new business ventures. Through it all, they had kept their promise of honesty, sharing their hopes, fears, and dreams with each other. Samuel had proven himself not just a capable ranch hand, but a skilled businessman as well, using knowledge gained from his uncle to help negotiate favorable terms with suppliers and distributors. Harlow had flourished too, gaining confidence in her growing literacy and her role as the keeper of her mother's culinary legacy. Together, they had transformed the Tumbleweed from a struggling cattle operation into a diversified enterprise that honored the past while building toward the future. As dessert was served, apple pie with cinnamon whipped cream, Thaddeus O'Brien rose from his chair and tapped his water glass with a spoon. The gathering quieted, all eyes turning to the patriarch of the Tumbleweed. "Friends and neighbors," he began, his voice strong and clear in the evening air. "A year ago, this ranch was on the brink of ruin. Today, we celebrate not just its survival, but its prosperity." Murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd. "Some of you know parts of the story, how my daughter's cooking saved the Tumbleweed, how an old friend's final gift helped secure our future, how a young man rode in looking for answers and found a home instead." Thaddeus's eyes found Samuel in the crowd, a look of paternal pride crossing his weathered features. "What you may not know is that today marks another chapter in that story." He beckoned to Harlow and Samuel. "Come up here, you two." Heat flooded Harlow's cheeks as she and Samuel made their way to the porch. Standing beside her father, with Samuel's steadying presence next to her, she faced the gathering of friends and neighbors who had supported them through the past year's changes. Thaddeus placed a hand on each of their shoulders. "It brings me more joy than I can express to announce that my daughter, Harlow, has agreed to marry Samuel McKinnon. The wedding will take place here at the Tumbleweed next month, and you're all invited to witness the joining of two families that should never have been separated in the first place." A cheer went up from the crowd, followed by applause and calls for a kiss. Samuel looked at Harlow, a question in his eyes. With a smile, she nodded slightly, and he leaned down to place a gentle, proper kiss on her lips, brief enough to maintain propriety, but long enough to leave no doubt about the depth of their feelings. As congratulations poured in from all sides, Edward Caldwell approached, hand extended. "Well played, O'Brien," he said to Thaddeus, though there was no malice in his tone. "You've managed to secure the Tumbleweed's future in more ways than one." "Not me," Thaddeus replied, nodding toward Harlow and Samuel. "Them, and Martha's legacy." Caldwell conceded the point with a nod. "To the future of the Tumbleweed, then." He raised his glass in a toast that was echoed throughout the gathering. Later, as the last guests departed and the yard grew quiet, Harlow and Samuel found themselves alone beneath the cottonwood tree. Above them, stars punctured the velvet darkness of the Wyoming night sky. The air was cool, carrying the scent of sage and the lingering aroma of the evening's feast. Samuel drew Harlow into his arms, his touch reverent as he traced the line of her jaw with his fingertips. "Are you happy?" he asked softly. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she replied, resting her head against his chest. "A year ago, I couldn't read, the ranch was failing, and I thought my life would always be defined by what I lacked. Now," she looked up at him, her eyes shining in the moonlight. "Now I have everything I never dared to want." "As do I," Samuel said. "When my uncle asked me to find Thaddeus O'Brien, I never imagined I'd find my future as well." Harlow smiled, remembering how fate had brought them together through a recipe she couldn't read and a promise Samuel had made to a dying man. "Do you think they planned it this way, your uncle and my mother? Leaving breadcrumbs for us to follow to this moment?" Samuel considered the question, his expression thoughtful. "I think they hoped for healing, for reconciliation. I don't know if they could have foreseen this exact outcome, but I like to think they'd approve." "I'm certain they would," Harlow said. She reached into her pocket and withdrew her mother's recipe, now framed between two pieces of glass for preservation. In the moonlight, the faded ink seemed to glow with an inner light. "The cook who couldn't read saved the ranch with her mother's secret recipe," she mused, "and found love in the bargain." "A fine story," Samuel agreed, drawing her closer. "Though I think the best chapters are yet to be written." As his lips met hers, Harlow knew he was right. The recipe that had brought them together was just the beginning, a first ingredient in the feast of a lifetime they would create together. And whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them as they had faced the past year, side by side, secrets surrendered, hearts open, and love abundant. Under the spreading branches of the cottonwood tree, with the tumbleweed stretching out around them like a promise, Samuel and Harlow sealed their future with a kiss that tasted of hope, happiness, and home.